Tonight, we travel back through time to discover the stories of those who endured the coldest, most merciless winters ever recorded. We'll walk with European peasants through centuries of ice, stand beside soldiers freezing in distant lands, and witness families clinging to survival when the world itself seemed determined to freeze all life from existence. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where winter never truly ends, where summer arrives late and leaves early, where crops fail year after year, where the very landscape transforms into something colder, harsher, more hostile than anyone living can remember. This was the reality for countless generations who lived through what historians now call the Little Ice Age. The period stretched across 5 centuries, from approximately 1300 until 1850. But unlike the dramatic ice ages of Earth's distant past, this wasn't a time when glaciers covered continents. Instead, it was something more insidious, a slow, relentless cooling that crept across the northern hemisphere, transforming the world in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Picture the Alps in the year 1300. For centuries, mountain communities had lived in harmony with their environment, their farms nestled in valleys that had been cultivated for generations. Then the glaciers began to advance, not all at once, not dramatically, just a few meters each year, then a few more. The ice moved down from the heights like a patient predator, swallowing farms that had fed families for centuries. In Switzerland, entire villages disappeared beneath the advancing ice. The Grindelwald Glacier, which had been stable for generations, began its inexorable march downward. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields vanished beneath rivers of ice. Churches built by their grandparents were crushed beneath the weight of frozen water. The land their families had worked for generations became uninhabitable. But it wasn't just the advancing ice that made life unbearable. The temperatures themselves had dropped. Where once grapes had ripened on sunny hillsides, now frost killed the vines before harvest. The growing season contracted from both ends. Spring arrived later each year, and autumn's killing frosts came earlier. In England, commercial vineyards that had flourished since Roman times withered and died. The climate that had once supported wine production simply ceased to exist. Farmers who had grown grapes for generations were forced to abandon their traditional crops and find new ways to survive. The Baltic Sea, which had always been navigable throughout most of the year, began freezing solid during winters. Pack ice extended far into the Atlantic, making shipping to Iceland and Greenland impossible for months at a time. The Norse colonies in Greenland, already struggling in the deteriorating climate, found themselves completely isolated as sea ice encased their settlements for longer and longer periods each year. The western colony collapsed first. Cut off from resupply, unable to grow enough food in the shortened growing season, the colonists simply starved. When ships finally reached the settlement years later, they found only empty buildings and scattered bones. The eastern colony held out longer, but eventually it too was abandoned. An entire civilization, built over centuries of careful adaptation to harsh conditions, simply ceased to exist when the climate shifted beyond their capacity to adapt. But let's move beyond these broad historical strokes and enter the lived experience of those who endured the Little Ice Age. Let's step into the world of a peasant family in northern France during the year 1593. The summer that year brought not warmth, but endless rain. Day after day, water fell from leaden skies. The fields turned to mud. Wheat that should have been ripening in golden sunshine instead rotted in waterlogged soil. What little grain managed to grow was stunted, diseased, worthless for either food or seed. This wasn't an isolated occurrence. The rains continued through 1594, then 1596, then 1597. 4 years of failed harvests. 4 years of watching winter reserves dwindle. 4 years of knowing that starvation was coming and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. In cottages throughout Northern Europe, families made impossible calculations. How much bread could they eat and still have seed for spring planting? Should they slaughter their animals now for food, or keep them alive in hopes of better conditions next year? How long could children survive on shortened rations before malnutrition made them vulnerable to every disease that swept through crowded, unsanitary villages? The social fabric began to tear. When everyone is starving, charity becomes impossible. When your own children are wasting away, the suffering of your neighbour's family becomes someone else's problem. Villages that had supported each other for generations turned inward, hoarding what little they had. The forests were stripped of anything edible. People ate bark. They dug for roots in frozen ground. They made soup from boiled leather. In the most desperate cases, there were whispered stories of darker things that civilized people weren't supposed to do. Things that hunger could drive even good people to consider. Cities fared little better than the countryside. In London, the price of grain skyrocketed beyond what common people could afford. The poor gathered outside bakeries, their hollow-eyed children clinging to their legs begging for bread. When none was forthcoming, desperation turned to violence. Bread riots erupted in cities across Europe. Angry mobs stormed granaries, attacked merchants, demanded that authorities do something, anything, to feed the starving masses. But what could authorities do? There simply wasn't enough food. The harvests had failed. No amount of political intervention could make grain appear where none existed. The wealthy, of course, survived. They always did. Those with money could import food from distant regions less affected by the climate disaster. They could hire guards to protect their stores of grain from desperate mobs. They could retreat to country estates where their own lands might still produce something edible. For the poor, there was only suffering and the slow descent into starvation. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Diseases that might have been survivable under better conditions became death sentences. Typhus swept through crowded tenements where families huddled together for warmth, their bodies too weak to fight infection. Dysentery ravaged populations whose desperation had driven them to eat anything remotely edible, no matter how contaminated. Children suffered most terribly. Their small bodies, still growing, needed nutrition that simply wasn't available. Growth stunted, bones weakened, minds developed more slowly. Those who survived bore the marks of their childhood starvation for the rest of their lives. The winter of 1607 to 1608 brought conditions so extreme that they entered folklore. It became known as the Great Frost. Temperatures plummeted to levels that split tree trunks like axe blows. The Thames River in London froze solid enough that people could walk across it. Not just walk across it, but hold entire fairs on the ice. From our perspective, centuries later, these frost fairs sound almost charming. Contemporary accounts describe people playing football on the frozen river, wrestling matches, dancing, skating. Vendors set up booths selling food and drink. It seems festive, joyful even, but beneath the festivities lay desperation. London's economy depended on the Thames. Goods were transported by river. Trade flowed along its waters. When the river froze, commerce stopped. Ships couldn't move. Cargo rotted in warehouses. Merchants went bankrupt. Workers who depended on river trade found themselves unemployed in the dead of winter, with no way to feed their families. The anonymous writer who documented the Great Frost, possibly Thomas Dekker, captured the underlying anxiety. He called the frozen river bankrupt, noting that London was cut off from the commerce that kept the city alive. Those made unemployed by the freeze, he wrote with bitter irony, were living a gentleman's life of idleness, not by choice but by cruel necessity. Fuel became desperately scarce. Wood and coal couldn't reach London by the usual river routes. Prices soared beyond what common people could afford. The poor had to choose between freezing and starving, between buying fuel to stay warm or food to stay alive. Many chose wrong. Many had no choice at all. In the countryside, the conditions were even worse. The writer describes ploughmen's children crying and blowing their nails to warm their frozen fingers. Oxen stood bellowing, sheep bleating, lambs shivering and starving to death. The entire natural order seemed to have turned against life itself. These weren't isolated incidents. The Great Frost was simply the most extreme manifestation of a climate that had fundamentally shifted. Year after year, decade after decade, the cold persisted. Glaciers continued their advance. Growing seasons remained shortened. Harvests failed with depressing regularity. Some historians believe that roughly 10% of the population of France died during the famines of 1693 to 1694. In Norway, similar proportions perished in 1695 to 1696. Sweden saw comparable losses in 1696 to 1697. In Estonia and Finland, the death toll was even higher, perhaps a fifth to a third of the entire population. These weren't just statistics. Each number represented a human being who starved to death, a mother who watched her children waste away, a farmer who worked his entire life only to see his family perish because the climate had changed beyond his capacity to adapt, an elder who had survived previous hardships but finally succumbed to conditions that exceeded anything in living memory. The Little Ice Age also transformed culture in unexpected ways. The Dutch Golden Age of painting emerged during the coldest decades. Artists like Peter Bruegel the Elder created their famous winter landscapes during the 1560s, capturing snowy scenes that reflected the harsh reality of their time. These weren't romantic representations of picturesque winter wonderlands. They were documents of a world transformed by cold. Look closely at Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow, and you'll see more than artistic beauty. You'll see people adapted to a climate that demanded constant labour just to survive. The hunters trudging through deep snow, their dogs exhausted, their shoulders bent under the weight of their meagre catch. The skaters on the frozen pond trying to find joy in circumstances that offered little. The bare trees, the heavy sky, the sense that winter has settled over the world and may never fully leave. The cultural impacts extended beyond art. According to historian James Burke, the Little Ice Age drove innovations in everyday life that we take for granted. The widespread use of buttons and buttonholes, the knitting of custom-made undergarments to provide better insulation, the invention of chimneys to replace open fires in the centre of communal halls, allowing houses to have multiple rooms with separation between masters and servants. Even the great violin maker Antonio Stradivari may have benefited from the climate. His instruments were crafted during the Little Ice Age, when colder temperatures caused trees to grow more slowly, producing denser wood. Some scholars argue this denser wood contributed to the legendary tone of Stradivarius violins, making them treasures that would be valued centuries later. But for those who lived through it, the Little Ice Age wasn't an opportunity for artistic achievement or technological innovation. It was a grinding, relentless trial of survival. It was watching your children go to bed hungry. It was rising before dawn to check if the fire had gone out, knowing that death from exposure was always just a few hours away. It was the gnawing anxiety of wondering whether this year's harvest would be enough, and the sick certainty that it probably wouldn't. The Little Ice Age teaches us that climate doesn't have to change dramatically to devastate civilization. A drop of just 2 degrees Celsius was enough to collapse Norse colonies, destroy established agricultural systems, cause famines that killed millions, and fundamentally transform European society. For those who endured it, the lesson was simpler and more brutal. Winter comes for all of us. Sometimes it comes and never fully leaves, and survival depends not on strength or virtue, but on adaptation, cooperation, and the random chance of being in the right place at the right time with the right resources. As we move deeper into our exploration of history's coldest winters, remember the families who endured centuries of climate disaster. Remember that they survived not through heroic individual effort, but through community support, shared knowledge, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender even when the world itself seems determined to destroy us. If the Little Ice Age was a slow torture stretching across centuries, the winter of 1709 to 1710 was acute agony, concentrated into a few months of unimaginable cold. This was the most extreme winter Europe had experienced in 500 years. Perhaps the most extreme winter in all of recorded European history. The cold came suddenly and with shocking intensity. On the night of January 5th, 1709, William Derham, a natural philosopher keeping weather records in Upminster, England near London, recorded a temperature of 12 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. This was the lowest temperature he had ever measured since beginning his observations in 1697. His contemporaries across Europe were recording similar extremes, down to 5 degrees Fahrenheit in some locations, but numbers, cold and abstract, can't capture what this felt like. Let's step into that winter and experience it through the eyes of those who barely survived it. Elizabeth Charlotte, Madame Palatine, the Duchess of Orleans, sat as close to her roaring fire as she dared without setting her furs alight. Every door in her palace was shut against the cold. She was wrapped in layer upon layer of the finest furs money could buy. And still she shivered so violently that she could barely hold her pen to write. In a letter to her great-aunt in Germany, she struggled to describe the unprecedented horror. "Never in my life have I seen a winter such as this one," she wrote, her hand trembling from cold as much as from the effort of gripping the pen. This wasn't aristocratic complaint. This was genuine terror from a woman who had access to more resources for staying warm than 99% of the population. If someone with her wealth and status could barely endure the cold, what hope did common people have? In Paris, the Seine froze solid. Not just a skim of ice that might form during a normal winter, but thick ice that could support the weight of horses and carts. People walked across the river as casually as they might use a bridge. Market stalls were set up on the ice. The frozen river became a thoroughfare because what else could you do? Life had to continue even when nature itself seemed to have declared war on human existence. But the frozen river also meant the end of commerce. Goods that normally flowed into Paris by boat were trapped. Supplies dwindled, prices rose, and all the while the cold continued its assault. Trees exploded in the forests. The sap inside them froze and expanded, splitting the trunks apart with sounds like cannon fire. Ancient oaks that had stood for centuries shattered in the night. In the morning, people would find the forest floor littered with fallen branches, the trees themselves cracked and ruined beyond any hope of recovery. Birds fell frozen from the sky. Not sick birds or weak birds, but healthy birds that simply could not survive the extreme temperatures. Their small bodies, which normally regulated temperature with such efficiency, simply shut down when exposed to cold that exceeded any evolutionary preparation. They dropped from branches mid-song, dead before they hit the frozen ground. Game animals fared no better. Deer were found frozen in standing positions, as if death had come so suddenly they didn't even have time to lie down. Rabbits huddled in their burrows until the cold found them there too, transforming hiding places into frozen tombs. For farmers, the winter of 1709 meant catastrophe. Wheat planted in autumn should have lain dormant under snow, waiting for spring's warmth to trigger growth. Instead, the unprecedented cold penetrated deep into the soil, killing the seeds before they ever had a chance to sprout. Entire fields of planted grain simply died in the ground. Fruit trees that had survived dozens of winters split apart like the forest oaks. Orchards that represented generations of careful cultivation were destroyed in a single season. The farmers who tended these orchards didn't just lose a year's crop, they lost decades of investment. Trees that couldn't be replaced except by planting new stock and waiting years for them to mature. Livestock died by the thousands. Cattle and sheep that had survived previous winters found this one beyond their endurance. Even with whatever shelter farmers could provide, even with all the fodder that could be gathered, animals simply froze to death in their pens. Farmers would wake to find their herds stiff and cold, their investment and food supply destroyed in a night. For the poor, the Great Frost was a death sentence carried out over weeks and months. Fuel became impossibly expensive as demand overwhelmed supply. Those who couldn't afford wood or coal had to choose between freezing in their homes or venturing out to gather what they could from forests and fields. Many died while trying to gather fuel. The cold was so intense that exposure for even relatively short periods could be fatal. People would go out to collect fallen branches and never return, their frozen bodies found days later, sometimes just yards from their destinations. In cities, the death toll mounted with horrifying speed. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The ground was frozen too hard for digging graves. The dead were stacked in warehouses and churches, waiting for a thaw that seemed like it might never come. Hospitals and poorhouses were overwhelmed. Those fortunate enough to have shelter huddled together for warmth, but crowding in unsanitary conditions bred disease. Typhus and pneumonia raced through populations already weakened by cold and hunger. What the cold didn't kill directly, disease claimed indirectly. The winter also struck at a particularly unfortunate time. The War of Spanish Succession was still raging across Europe. Armies that were supposed to be fighting found themselves simply trying to survive. Soldiers froze in their camps. Cavalry horses died, leaving mounted units useless. Supply lines that were difficult to maintain in the best of times became completely impossible. In Sweden, the winter proved catastrophic for King Charles XI's invasion of Russia during the Great Northern War. His army, already struggling against Russian scorched earth tactics, was devastated by the unprecedented cold. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was so severe that it undermined Swedish military power for a generation. The Swedish army lost thousands of soldiers to the cold, not in battle, not to enemy action, simply frozen to death in their camps or during night marches. There's a particularly chilling account of a single night away from proper shelter that killed at least 2,000 soldiers. They simply lay down in the snow and never woke up. Those who survived bore the marks of extreme cold for the rest of their lives. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, ears, noses. Gangrene from frozen tissue meant amputations without anesthesia, performed by battlefield surgeons with crude tools. Many died from the amputations themselves. Those who survived were maimed for life. Back in civilian life, the economic impacts rippled outward from the immediate catastrophe. With crops destroyed and livestock dead, famine followed the frost. Grain prices soared to levels that made bread unaffordable for common people. Riots erupted in cities as hungry people demanded action from authorities who had no solutions to offer. The famine of 1709 extended into 1710 and beyond. It takes time to rebuild herds. It takes a growing season to replace destroyed crops, and in the meantime, people had to eat. Many didn't make it. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands died across Europe from the combined effects of cold and subsequent starvation. Some regions suffered more than others. In France, which was already strained by the costs of war, the winter created a humanitarian disaster. In Switzerland, already impacted by the advancing glaciers of the Little Ice Age, the extreme cold pushed many communities past the breaking point. In Scotland and Scandinavia, where winters were normally harsh anyway, the unprecedented severity of 1709 claimed lives even in communities that thought they were prepared for anything winter could bring. The Great Frost also revealed the limits of technology and infrastructure. Canals froze solid, halting the growing network of water transport that was supposed to modernize European commerce. Roads became impassable, buried under snow that no amount of labor could clear fast enough. Cities that depended on regular supply from the countryside found themselves cut off, their populations facing starvation because food couldn't physically reach them. Some attempted to adapt with desperate creativity. In regions where the cold made traditional heating impossible to maintain, people resorted to communal warming shelters where bodies could share heat. Families moved in with neighbors, packing multiple households into single rooms to pool their resources and warmth. Others tried to continue with normal life, pretending that this was just another hard winter that would eventually pass. They went to their jobs, tried to keep their businesses running, attended church and market as if nothing was wrong. This denial sometimes killed them. The cold wasn't something you could ignore or push through with determination. It demanded respect, adaptation, surrender to its power. Children born during the Great Frost grew up with stories of the winter that tried to kill their parents. These stories became part of family lore, passed down through generations. Great-grandparents would tell children about the winter when the world froze, when death lurked in every shadow, when simply surviving from one day to the next was an achievement worth celebrating. The scientific community struggled to explain what had happened. Without modern understanding of climate systems, they grasped for explanations. Some blamed unusual patterns of sunspots. Others thought volcanic eruptions might be responsible. A few suggested that the hand of God was at work, punishing humanity for its sins. Modern climatologists are still working to fully understand the Great Frost. They know it was real. The historical records are too consistent, too widespread to doubt. But correlating what happened in 1709 with known causes of cold weather in Europe has proven difficult. Something unusual was happening in the climate system, something that pushed temperatures to extremes beyond what any previous generation had experienced. The winter eventually ended, as winters always do. Spring came late that year, and when it finally arrived, it revealed a landscape transformed by months of extreme cold. Dead trees, frozen fields, shattered orchards, and everywhere the signs of human suffering. But humans are remarkably resilient. The survivors rebuilt, they planted new crops, they started new herds, they repaired damaged buildings and cleared away the debris of winter's destruction. Life continued because life must continue, yet the Great Frost left permanent marks on European society. It reinforced the understanding that climate was not a stable background against which human history unfolded, but an active force that could suddenly turn catastrophic. It taught that preparation had limits, that even the wealthy and powerful could be brought low by sufficiently extreme conditions. It demonstrated that survival often came down to luck as much as planning, and perhaps most importantly, it showed that community support was essential. Those who survived the Great Frost often did so because neighbours helped neighbours, because churches organised relief, because communities pooled their resources and looked after the most vulnerable. Those who tried to face the winter alone, trusting only in their own resources, frequently didn't make it. As we continue our journey through history's coldest winters, keep in mind the lessons of the Great Frost. Cold beyond imagining can arrive suddenly. Preparation helps but guarantees nothing. And in the face of nature's fury, human beings survive not through individual strength but through collective care for one another. The winter of 1816 wasn't actually a winter at all. It was a summer that never came, and in many ways that made it worse than the deepest freeze. To understand what happened, we need to travel back one more year, to April of 1815, to a place most Europeans had never heard of. A small island called Sumbawa in Indonesia, where a mountain named Tambora was about to change the world. Mount Tambora had been quiet for thousands of years. The people living on its slopes had no memory of it ever erupting. It was just part of the landscape, a mountain like any other. Then, on April 5th, 1815, it began to rumble. What followed was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. For days, Tambora exploded with a violence that defies imagination. It ejected 200 megatons of dust, rock, sulfur, and gases into the stratosphere. The explosion literally sheared the mountain nearly in half. 90,000 people on Sumbawa died in the immediate aftermath. The local tsunami, the pyroclastic flows, the ashfall that buried entire villages. But this was just the beginning. The ash and gases that Tambora hurled into the stratosphere began to spread across the globe. Lighter particles remained suspended in the upper atmosphere, creating an aerosol cloud the size of Australia. This cloud blocked sunlight from reaching Earth's surface, and the climate began to change. By the spring of 1816, the effects were becoming apparent. But few people connected the strange weather to a volcanic eruption on the other side of the world. How could they? News travelled slowly in those days. Most people in Europe and North America had never even heard of Tambora. All they knew was that something was terribly, frighteningly wrong with the weather. Let's step into New England in the spring of 1816. The Reverend Thomas Robbins in East Windsor, Connecticut, was keeping detailed weather observations in his diary, as he had done for 20 years. What he recorded that spring would become one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of the climate disaster unfolding across the Northern Hemisphere. In early March, Robbins planted peas, as he did every year. Normal spring weather should have brought them up within weeks. Instead, the cold lingered. Vegetation didn't advance. The earth seemed reluctant to wake from winter's sleep. April brought a cold snap that killed off most of the newly planted crops at higher elevations across Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and upstate New York. Farmers watched in dismay as frost blackened fields they'd just finished planting. But this was just an unusually late freeze, they told themselves. It happened sometimes. Summer would come and they could replant. May arrived, and with it, hope. Fruit trees bloomed as they always did, their blossoms promising apples and cherries later in the year. But 3 weeks into the month, great frosts occurred. The delicate blossoms blackened and died. The fruit harvest was lost before it had even begun. Then came June 6th. Snow fell in Albany, New York, and Dennisville, Maine. Snow in June. This wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented in living memory. In Cape May, New Jersey, frost was reported on 5 consecutive nights in late June. Extensive crop damage followed. The growing season, already shortened by the late spring, was being attacked from the summer end as well. On June 5th, a strange thing happened in Ipswich, Massachusetts. A heat wave arrived, raising temperatures to 92 degrees. Finally, people thought, summer has arrived. But that very afternoon, a cold front swept across New England. But the next morning, the temperature had dropped to 43 degrees. The whiplash from heat to cold, from hope to despair, was devastating. For the next 4 days, severe frosts occurred along the eastern seaboard. Ice began to form on water left standing outside overnight. Small migratory birds, which had flown north expecting summer conditions, died by the thousands. Their small bodies littered fields, silent testimony to a climate gone mad. The cold winds of June made most people who ventured out wear heavy coats. A clockmaker named Chauncey Jerome later wrote about June 7th. While walking to work about a mile from home, dressed in thick woolen clothes and an overcoat, his hands got so cold that he had to stop working and put on a pair of mittens he'd brought in his pocket. In June, throughout the summer, the pattern continued. Rapid, dramatic temperature swings, days of warmth followed by killing frosts. The sky remained hazy with a sulphurous tinge. Sunlight looked wrong, dimmed and reddened by the volcanic aerosols in the upper atmosphere. Sunspots became visible to the naked eye, adding to the sense that something fundamental had broken in the natural order. What corn managed to grow never ripened. By September, 4 severe frosts occurred, destroying what little crop had survived the summer. The corn that did grow was useless, mouldy, and not fit even for animal feed. Farmers faced the awful realization that they had no harvest to speak of. More critically, they had no seed for the next year's planting. Across New England, famine became a real and immediate threat. The price of oats rose from 12 cents a bushel to 92 cents. Hay was so scarce that cattle couldn't be fed through the coming winter. Farm families faced an agonizing choice: slaughter their livestock now and salt the meat, or try to keep the animals alive through winter without adequate feed and risk losing everything. Many chose to slaughter. Others couldn't bear to destroy animals they'd raised from birth. When winter came, these families watched their cattle and horses slowly starve, a lingering death that was harder to watch than a quick knife stroke would have been. Some villagers in Vermont reportedly survived on hedgehogs and boiled nettles. Anything edible was consumed. Forests were scoured for mushrooms, roots, berries, anything that might provide calories. People ate food they would have rejected as animal feed in normal times. The brutal cold of 1816 added more misery to an already intolerable situation. New England was still recovering from the War of 1812, which had disrupted trade and strained the economy. Now, with crops failing and livestock dying, many families faced complete ruin. Thousands began the Great Migration westward. They loaded what possessions they could carry onto wagons and headed for the Midwest, leaving behind farms their families had worked for generations. They had no choice. You can't eat land that won't grow food. You can't feed children with failed harvests and empty root cellars. This migration would have lasting impacts on American expansion, but for those who lived it, it wasn't a grand historical movement. It was refugees fleeing catastrophe, hoping that somewhere west of the failed lands they might find a place where summer still existed. Across the Atlantic, Europe was experiencing its own version of hell. The continent was still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, which had only ended the previous year. Infrastructure was damaged, economies were in ruins, governments were struggling to maintain order in the face of massive social disruption. And now came the crop failures of 1816. In Switzerland, 130 days of rain fell between April and September. Lake Geneva swelled, flooding the city along its shores. In the mountains, snow refused to melt even as summer should have been at its height. Mary Shelley, visiting Switzerland that year, wrote of being confined to her lakeside villa by an almost perpetual rain. She described storms more fierce than any she had seen, with lightning illuminating the mountains before pitchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts. When the crops failed, thousands died of starvation during what historians now call continental Europe's last great famine. The numbers of homeless ran into the hundreds of thousands. People abandoned farms and villages, streaming into cities that had no capacity to feed or shelter them. The scale of suffering in Switzerland was among the worst in Europe. Famine was particularly severe in the more densely populated eastern regions. In western Switzerland, the cold was so intense that an ice dam formed below a tongue of the Gietro Glacier, creating a dangerous lake. Despite efforts to drain it, the ice dam collapsed catastrophically in June of 1818, killing 40 people in the resulting flood. Across Europe, hungry people demonstrated in front of grain markets and bakeries. Riots erupted in cities from Paris to Rome. Though food riots were common during times of scarcity, the violence of 1816 and 1817 exceeded anything seen since the French Revolution. In Ireland, the failure of wheat, oat and potato harvests created famine conditions that particularly affected the north and southwest. A nation already suffering from centuries of exploitation and poverty was pushed to the edge of survival. Between 1816 and 1819, major typhus epidemics swept across Europe. The famine had weakened populations, making them vulnerable to disease. Typhus thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of refugee camps and urban slums where the displaced poor huddled together. Italy, Switzerland, Scotland and Ireland all saw major outbreaks that claimed thousands of lives. Food prices rose sharply throughout Europe. Bread, the staple of life for most people, became unaffordable. Parents watched their children go hungry and could do nothing. The desperation was palpable, the sense that the world had turned against humanity itself. In Asia, the disrupted climate brought different but equally devastating effects. The monsoon season in China was delayed and disrupted, resulting in overwhelming floods in the Yangtze Valley. Fields that should have been growing rice were instead underwater. In other regions, drought prevailed where rain should have fallen. Summer snowfall was reported in various locations in Jiangxi and Anhui. In Taiwan, snow fell in Hsinchu and Miaoli, and frost was reported in Changhua. These were regions where snow was virtually unknown. A large-scale famine in Yunnan helped reverse the fortunes of the ruling Qing dynasty. Global crop yields may have fallen by as much as 90% in the hardest-hit regions. For a world where most people lived on subsistence agriculture, where there were no global supply chains to distribute food from surplus to deficit regions, this was catastrophic. Some historians believe the social upheaval caused by the year without a summer contributed to political movements that would reshape the world in coming decades. Desperate, hungry people make revolutionary crowds. The old order, which had failed to protect them from starvation, lost legitimacy in their eyes, but there were also unexpected cultural impacts. That villa where Mary Shelley was staying, confined indoors by the terrible weather, was where she and her companions decided to write ghost stories to entertain themselves. From Mary Shelley's imagination came Frankenstein. From Lord Byron came work that would influence Gothic literature for generations. Without the year, without a summer, we wouldn't have Frankenstein. The creature that has become an icon of popular culture was born from the same volcanic eruption that killed hundreds of thousands through famine and disease, art and catastrophe, beauty and horror emerging from the same unnatural summer. The year eventually ended. 1817 arrived, and with it, a slow return to more normal weather patterns. But the damage had been done. The seed grain had been eaten. Livestock herds had been decimated. Countless people had died. Societies had been disrupted in ways that would take years to fully recover from. The year without a summer teaches us that climate disasters can arrive from unexpected sources. A volcanic eruption on the other side of the world can destroy your harvest and starve your family. We live in an interconnected system where distant events can have local impacts beyond anything we might imagine. It also teaches us about the fragility of our food systems. When crops fail globally, when normal growing seasons are disrupted, there's no easy solution. You can't make food appear through policy or willpower. Either the earth produces or people starve. It's that simple and that terrible. As we move forward in our exploration of history's coldest winters, remember the families who endured the year that summer never came. Remember that they survived not through their own merit, but through luck, through community support, and through the stubborn human refusal to give up even when the sun itself seems to have abandoned the world. Picture this. You're a soldier in the greatest army the world has ever seen. 600,000 strong, you've marched from France across Europe, conquering everything in your path. You serve an emperor who seems unbeatable. Victory has been your constant companion for so many years that defeat seems impossible. It's June 24th, 1812. You cross the Niemen River into Russia, and you can already taste the triumph that awaits. Moscow will fall. The Tsar will sue for peace. The campaign will be over by autumn, and you'll winter in comfort before returning home to parades and glory. 6 months later, you're one of perhaps 10,000 survivors stumbling back across that same river. Most of your friends are dead. Your fingers and toes are black with frostbite. You've seen things that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life, assuming you survive long enough to have dreams again. This is the story of how winter destroyed the Grande Armée. Napoleon's invasion of Russia is one of the best-studied military campaigns in history, and much of what people believe about it is wrong. The popular version goes like this. Napoleon marched triumphantly into Moscow with his army largely intact. The Russians burned the city, forcing him to retreat. Then the Russian winter destroyed his army. The reality was far more complex and far more terrible. The disaster began long before winter arrived. The Russian army refused to fight the decisive battle Napoleon always sought. Instead, they retreated eastward, employing a scorched earth policy. Everything that might be useful to the French was destroyed. Crops were burned. Livestock was driven away or slaughtered. Villages were abandoned and sometimes burned. Towns were evacuated. The Grande Armée found itself marching through a wasteland. The supply lines, already stretched thin across hundreds of miles, couldn't keep up with the army's needs. Soldiers began going hungry. Then they began starving. Disease struck with devastating efficiency. Typhus spread through the ranks like wildfire. Dysentery followed. The heat of the Russian summer, combined with contaminated water and inadequate sanitation, created perfect conditions for epidemic disease. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in mid-August, just 1 month into the campaign, he had already lost 80,000 soldiers, not to battle, not to the enemy, to typhus, dysentery, and the simple physical strain of forced marches across hostile territory. The Russian army retreated before him still. Napoleon pushed on toward Moscow, his army shrinking with every mile. On September 7th, the Russians finally gave battle at Borodino. It was one of the bloodiest single days of combat in the Napoleonic Wars. The French suffered 30,000 casualties. The Russians lost 50,000. But the Russian army wasn't destroyed. It retreated again, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon entered the city on September 14th with approximately 100,000 exhausted, hungry men. This was less than a sixth of the force that had crossed the Niemen just 3 months earlier. Moscow was largely empty. The population had been evacuated. More critically, the Russians had destroyed most of the food stores before leaving. That night, fires broke out across the city. The Russians had set Moscow itself ablaze rather than let it provision the French army. Napoleon watched the fires from the Kremlin. Oh, it was the most grand, the most sublime, and the most terrifying sight the world ever beheld, he later recalled. Mountains of flame rolling like waves. The destruction was beautiful and catastrophic in equal measure. The emperor expected the Tsar to negotiate. Surely Alexander would sue for peace rather than let Moscow burn. But no peace overture came. Days passed, then weeks. Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow for a surrender that would never come. Autumn was advancing. The nights were getting colder. Supply wagons from the west weren't arriving with the regularity needed to sustain the army. Food stores in Moscow were nearly exhausted. On October 19th, Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat. 95,000 soldiers began the long march westward. They were already weakened by months of inadequate rations and disease. They were demoralized by the failure to force Russia's surrender, and they were about to face one of the harshest winters in living memory. For the first few weeks, the weather remained relatively mild. The retreat proceeded in reasonable order. Then, on November the 3rd, the first significant snow fell. Temperatures plummeted, and everything changed. The cold was unlike anything most of these soldiers had experienced. Remember, the Grande Armée was drawn from all across Napoleon's empire. French soldiers from the south, Italians from the Mediterranean, Germans from regions where winter was mild. They had no reference for what Russian winter could do. Their uniforms, adequate for Western European campaigns, provided almost no protection against the kind of cold that seized them now. Woolen coats designed for autumn weather in France were useless against temperatures that dropped to 30 degrees below zero on the Fahrenheit scale, sometimes lower. Soldiers' breath froze in the air before them. Ice crystals formed in beards and moustaches. Fingers went numb inside inadequate gloves. Toes lost feeling inside wet boots. The warnings of frostbite came too late for most. By the time you realized something was wrong, the damage was already done. The army's horses began dying in huge numbers. These animals, essential for transportation and cavalry operations, simply couldn't survive the combination of cold, inadequate fodder, and exhaustion. When horses died, the supplies they carried had to be abandoned. Artillery pieces were left beside the road. Wagons full of equipment were emptied and burned for brief, desperately needed warmth. The death of the cavalry horses had another effect. It made the army vulnerable to the Cossack raiders who harassed its flanks and rear constantly. These Russian light cavalry, mounted on hardy steppe ponies adapted to extreme cold, struck at will against a French force that could no longer effectively pursue or respond. Soldiers began throwing away their weapons. The weight was too much for starving, exhausted men to carry. When you're struggling just to place one foot in front of the other, when your entire focus narrows to the simple act of continuing to move forward, a musket becomes an impossible burden. Many joined the ever-growing band of stragglers. These were men who had simply given up on maintaining military discipline. They wandered behind the main army, scavenging what they could find, attacking supply wagons, sometimes even murdering their fellow soldiers for a piece of bread or a warmer coat. The first killing frost overnight came early in November. Men who had survived the day simply didn't wake up in the morning. They lay down to sleep around campfires and froze to death when the fires burned out. In the morning, their comrades would find them stiff and cold, their eyes still open, staring at nothing. By mid-November, the organized retreat was disintegrating into a rout. Military units lost cohesion. Discipline collapsed. It became every man for himself in a desperate struggle just to survive one more day. The river crossings were nightmares beyond description. As the French approached the Berezina River, they learned that the vital bridge at Borisov had been captured and destroyed by the Russians. The army was trapped with a river in front and Russian forces pursuing from behind. 400 pontoneers worked in water up to their necks, building 2 makeshift bridges under fire from Russian artillery. They worked in shifts of 15 minutes, because that's all a man could endure before hypothermia made further work impossible. Ice floes washed past them as they struggled with the heavy timbers. Of these 400 brave men, only 8 survived the retreat. The crossing itself was chaos. Thousands of soldiers and refugees tried to force their way across the narrow bridges simultaneously. People were knocked down in the crush and trampled to death. Some fell off the bridges into the freezing water and drowned. Russian artillery shells exploded in the packed crowds, killing dozens with each impact. A 2-day blizzard starting on November 29th was remembered by survivors as the worst time. The wind drove snow so hard that visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plunged. Some soldiers shot themselves rather than continue. Those whose boots had disintegrated got such bad frostbite that skin and muscle peeled away from the bones of their feet. Soldiers who fell down had their boots pulled off by other soldiers, even if they weren't yet dead. Men murdered for fur coats. There were incidents of cannibalism. Desperate, starving men ate the flesh of dead comrades. This is the endpoint of hunger and desperation, the final collapse of civilization and human decency in the face of survival. When the blizzard finally passed, clear skies allowed the temperature to plunge even lower. Some thermometers recorded readings of 38 degrees Celsius below zero. At such temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath becomes painful. Every inhalation sears the lungs. Continuing to move forward requires a level of determination that borders on the supernatural. 2 fresh divisions deployed to defend the town of Vilna froze to death over 2 nights. These were thousands of soldiers who hadn't been hardened by the retreat, who hadn't gradually adapted to the cold. They simply died where they stood, frozen solid in their positions. The Russians who pursued the French weren't immune to the suffering. Of the 97,000 who started the pursuit, only 27,000 reached Vilna. Russian General Denis Davidov later wrote that he remembered colder winters in previous years, but never with large, starving armies caught in the open. In all, counting civilians and soldiers on both sides, around 1 million people died because of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. 1 million human beings, each with their own hopes and dreams and families waiting for them to return home. Most of those families waited in vain. Napoleon himself abandoned the army in early December, racing back to Paris in a sleigh to deal with political challenges at home and to begin raising a new army. He left his men to their fate, which for most of them was death in the Russian winter. When the survivors finally staggered back across the Niemen in December, perhaps 10,000 of the original 600,000 remained in any kind of fighting condition. The Grande Armée, the greatest military force Europe had ever seen, had been effectively destroyed. But here's the crucial thing that many accounts miss. Winter wasn't the primary destroyer of Napoleon's army. Disease and starvation had already claimed hundreds of thousands before the first snow fell. The failure to force a decisive battle, the scorched earth tactics, the inadequate supply lines, these were the real killers. Winter was simply the final blow that finished off an army already mortally wounded. The extreme cold killed soldiers who were already weakened by months of inadequate food and disease. It claimed men who might have survived in better conditions but had no reserves left to fight the elements. The lesson of Napoleon's retreat isn't just about being prepared for winter. It's about understanding the cumulative effects of prolonged hardship. It's about recognizing that humans have limits, and that pushing beyond those limits eventually leads to catastrophic failure. It's also about the danger of assuming that will and determination can overcome any obstacle. Napoleon was perhaps the greatest military commander of his age. His soldiers were veterans of numerous campaigns. They were brave, skilled, experienced, and still they were destroyed, not primarily by enemy action but by hunger, disease, and cold. The survivors carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen friends freeze to death. They had eaten things no person should have to eat. They had witnessed the complete collapse of military order and human decency in the face of extreme suffering. Many were permanently maimed by frostbite. Fingers, toes, ears, noses lost to the cold, gangrene and amputation, infection and death. Those who kept their limbs often suffered from chronic pain and reduced mobility for the rest of their lives. The psychological scars were perhaps even deeper. How do you process having survived when so many didn't? How do you reconcile the things you did to survive with the person you thought you were? How do you sleep when closing your eyes brings back the nightmares of frozen corpses and starving comrades? Napoleon's Russian campaign destroyed more than just an army. It destroyed the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the French military. It showed that Napoleon could be beaten. It encouraged his enemies and undermined his political support at home. Within 2 years, Napoleon would be defeated and exiled. Within 3, he would make his final gamble at Waterloo and lose. The seeds of his downfall were planted in the frozen wastes of Russia, watered by the blood of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who died believing they were serving the greatest commander in history. As we continue exploring history's coldest winters, remember the Grande Armée. Remember that preparation matters, but it's not everything. Remember that even the strongest and most determined can be brought low by conditions beyond their control. And remember that survival often comes down to factors beyond individual courage or skill, to the random chance of being in the right place at the right time with the right resources. The American frontier in the 1880s was a place of boundless optimism and profound delusion. Eastern investors, seduced by tales of vast grasslands that could support unlimited cattle, poured millions into massive ranching operations. The open range, they believed, was an infinite resource that would make them rich beyond measure. They were about to learn in the most brutal way possible that nature doesn't care about human ambitions. The summer and autumn of 1886 brought warning signs that anyone who truly understood the land would have recognized. The cattle had grown unusually thick winter coats, so dense they looked prehistoric. The horses developed similar protection. Even the chickens grew additional down beneath their regular feathers. The squirrels had been working with desperate intensity since late August, gathering nuts and seeds with an urgency that exceeded normal preparation for winter. Beavers along the creeks had built dams of unprecedented size and complexity, structures that seemed over-engineered for normal conditions. Indigenous knowledge holders, like the elderly Lakota man called Running Bear who appears in historical accounts from this period, understood what these signs meant. The animals were preparing for something beyond a normal winter. The earth was speaking to those willing to listen, warning of trials ahead, but the large ranching operations from back east paid no attention to such signs. They had scientists and modern methods. They had capital and business plans. They had confidence born of several mild winters that made it seem like the stories of harsh plains winters were exaggerated. Their cattle roamed freely across the open range, tens of thousands of animals that would have to survive on whatever grass they could find beneath the snow. This extensive grazing had already depleted the range. The best grass was gone, eaten during the summer and autumn. What remained was sparse, nutritionally poor, insufficient to sustain large animals through months of cold. November of 1886 started with an ominous shift in the weather. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night. Frost patterns on cabin windows became so intricate they resembled delicate etchings. When the wind blew, it wasn't just cold, it was something alive and predatory, stealing breath with shocking efficiency. By early December, the transformation was complete. The world became a place of infinite whiteness, where familiar landmarks disappeared beneath drifts. The horizon dissolved into pale sky, indistinguishable from the snow-covered earth. Then came the blizzards. Not one, but a series of storms that hammered the Great Plains throughout the winter. The first major storm in early January brought temperatures down to 30 below zero. Snow fell so thickly that visibility dropped to arm's length. Wind shrieked across the prairie with such force that it was physically difficult to stand upright. The cattle, which were supposed to survive by grazing through winter, found themselves in an impossible situation. The snow was too deep. The grass was too sparse even when they could reach it, and the temperatures were so extreme that they were losing body heat faster than eating could replace it. Cattle behavior during extreme cold is to turn their backs to the wind and drift with the storm. This instinct, which might help individual animals survive normal winters, became a death sentence during the winter of 1886 to 87. The cattle drifted until they hit a barrier, a fence line, a creek bank, a geographical feature that stopped their movement. Then they stopped, and they died. By the hundreds, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. Cowboys who rode out to check on herds found scenes of horror. Cattle piled against fences in massive heaps, frozen solid where they'd stopped drifting. Entire herds dead in ravines where they'd sought shelter. Animals frozen in standing positions, as if death had come so suddenly they didn't even fall down. The scale of death was unprecedented. The massive ranching operations that had seemed so profitable, so modern, so destined for success, were watching their entire investments literally freeze to death. Some ranchers tried to save their herds. They rode out in killing cold, trying to drive cattle to shelter, or at least to better grazing. Many of these cowboys never returned. They froze to death in blizzards, becoming lost in whiteout conditions just yards from safety. There are accounts of cowboys finding shelter in creek beds, only to freeze to death overnight when their fires went out. Of riders becoming separated from their horses and dying of exposure before they could walk to the nearest homestead. Of men making it to shelter, but having their hands and feet so severely frostbitten that amputation was necessary. Small homesteading families fared much better than the large ranching operations. These families understood what frontier life demanded. They'd built adequate shelter for their animals. They'd stored hay and feed to supplement grazing. They'd prepared for extended isolation. Their animals were kept in barns or near buildings where they could be checked and fed. When blizzards hit, these families could bring their animals even closer to human habitation. The cow might spend the worst storms in a lean-to attached to the cabin. The chickens might be brought into the cabin itself. This careful husbandry meant survival. While the open-range cattle were dying by the hundreds of thousands, homesteader animals, though stressed by the extreme cold, generally survived. The human toll was also significant, though much lower than the animal losses. Homesteaders died when they became lost in blizzards while trying to reach their barns or outhouses. Guide ropes strung between buildings saved many lives, but some people didn't have such ropes or didn't use them properly. There are heartbreaking accounts of bodies found just feet from doorways. People who had become disoriented in whiteout conditions and wandered in circles until they collapsed from cold and exhaustion. Sometimes these people could see lights from their cabin windows but couldn't determine the correct direction to walk. Children died when they were caught away from shelter when storms hit. The accounts from this winter include stories of school children dying in blizzards while trying to get home, of families losing members who had gone to town for supplies and never returned. One particularly tragic story involves a family where the father went to the barn to tend animals and never came back. The mother waited as long as she dared, then went out to find him, leaving the children in the cabin. Neither parent returned. The children waited 3 days before neighbors found them, half starved and nearly frozen. Their parents' bodies eventually discovered in the barn where they'd frozen to death after getting lost in the short distance between house and barn. The winter seemed endless. Storm after storm swept across the plains. Brief periods of clear weather, which brought plummeting temperatures, were followed by new blizzards. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel impossible. Homesteading families found themselves isolated for weeks or months at a time. Those who had prepared adequately could wait out the storms. Those who hadn't, who had been less careful in their preparations or had simply had bad luck, faced desperate shortages. Food supplies that were supposed to last through winter ran low. Fuel stores were exhausted. Some families began burning furniture and parts of their buildings to stay warm. Others slaughtered animals they couldn't feed, salting the meat even though they had no way to replace the animals in spring. The psychological strain of confinement in small spaces during extreme cold took its toll. Families that might get along fine under normal conditions found tempers fraying during weeks of being trapped together. Children grew restless, adults grew depressed. The endless white landscape visible through frost-covered windows seemed to mock hope itself, but there were also stories of remarkable resilience and community support. Families who had supplies shared with neighbours who had run short. Men risked their lives riding through storms to check on isolated homesteads and provide assistance where needed. Communities organised relief efforts to help those who had lost everything. Spring, when it finally came, revealed the full scope of the disaster. The prairie was littered with cattle carcasses as far as anyone could see. Estimates put the death toll at hundreds of thousands of animals across the Great Plains. Some of the massive ranching operations had lost their entire herds. The economic impact was staggering. Investors who had poured millions into Western ranching were bankrupt. The romantic vision of the open range where cattle could thrive with minimal human intervention was revealed as dangerously naive. Many of the large operations folded completely, their owners returning east with nothing to show for years of investment. Others adapted, abandoning the open range model and instead building proper winter shelters, storing hay, reducing herd sizes to sustainable levels. The winter of 1886 to 87 marked the end of an era. The age of huge free-ranging herds was over. What replaced it was a more careful, more sustainable approach to ranching that acknowledged the realities of plains weather. Smaller operations like those run by homesteading families proved more resilient. They'd never relied on the myth of an endless frontier that could support unlimited exploitation. They'd understood from the beginning that survival on the plains required respect for the land and careful preparation for winter's inevitable return. The winter also demonstrated the value of indigenous knowledge. Those who learned from people like Running Bear, who paid attention to animal behavior and subtle signs in the natural world, were better prepared than those who relied solely on modern scientific confidence. This wasn't a rejection of science and modernity. It was recognition that survival in challenging environments requires multiple forms of knowledge. Traditional ecological understanding, developed over centuries of living in a particular place, offers insights that newcomers can't match without years of careful observation. The Great Die-Up entered Western folklore as a cautionary tale. Cowboys sang songs about it. Old-timers told stories to younger generations about the winter that killed the open range. The lesson was clear: nature bats last, and hubris in the face of environmental realities leads to catastrophe. For modern people facing climate change and environmental disruption, the winter of 1886 to 87 offers relevant lessons. Large-scale operations based on assumptions of stable environmental conditions are vulnerable when those conditions change. Small-scale, adaptive approaches that work with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them prove more resilient, and indigenous knowledge, too often dismissed as primitive or irrelevant, contains wisdom that modern societies ignore at their peril. As we continue exploring history's coldest winters, remember the cattle frozen against fence lines and the cowboys who died trying to save them. Remember the homesteading families who survived through preparation and community support. And remember that every environment has limits, and respecting those limits is the difference between sustainable life and catastrophic failure. If the winter of 1886 to 87 transformed the American West, the cold snap of February 1899 showed that even the South wasn't safe from winter's fury. The Great Arctic Outbreak, as it came to be known, delivered an icy slap to every corner of the continental United States. It made all previous cold snaps seem mild by comparison. This wasn't regional cold or localized disaster. This was a continental-scale freeze that demonstrated nature's power to transform familiar landscapes into hostile foreign worlds. The cold hit the West Coast first in the early days of February. San Diego, a city that prided itself on perpetual sunshine and comfortable temperatures, recorded lows of 33 degrees Fahrenheit. This might not sound extreme to people from colder climates, but for a region where citrus trees grew year-round, where subtropical plants flourished in carefully cultivated gardens, this was shocking. Seattle saw temperatures drop to 12 degrees. The Pacific Northwest, normally protected from extreme cold by maritime influences, found itself gripped by conditions more typical of interior continental regions. Then the cold moved east, gathering strength as it went. By mid-February it had seized the entire country in a grip unlike anything in living memory. Tampa, Florida recorded its first measurable snowfall in the city's history. Tampa, where oranges grew, where people went to escape northern winters, where the very idea of snow seemed absurd. Trace amounts of snow fell further down the Gulf Coast. In Miami, the mercury dipped below freezing. Desperate farmers set fires among their orange groves, trying to save their trees from the killing cold. They wrapped trees for protection, burning anything they could find to create pockets of warmth in the frozen landscape. But the fires weren't enough. The cold was too intense, too persistent. Entire orange groves were destroyed. Trees that had taken years to reach maturity, that represented farmers' entire livelihoods, froze to death in a matter of days. The agricultural losses in Florida alone were catastrophic. The citrus industry, which had seemed like Florida's ticket to prosperity, was devastated. It would take years for the groves to recover, assuming farmers had the resources to replant and wait for new trees to mature. But Florida was just one part of the story. The cold swept across the South with devastating efficiency. In Virginia, temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero. In New York City, the East River froze hard enough to create an ice bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Think about that for a moment. The East River, a tidal strait that sees constant water movement, that carries ships and cargo, that is part of one of the world's busiest port systems. It froze solid enough that people could walk across it. This wasn't the first time the East River had frozen. There are accounts of ice bridges in earlier decades, but combined with all the other extreme conditions that February, it reinforced the sense that something unprecedented was happening. In Washington, D.C., the day after the mercury hit an all-time low of 15 degrees below zero, a massive blizzard struck. The nation's capital was already under a thick blanket of snow. Now 21 additional inches fell. Capitol Hill disappeared under 10-foot-high snowdrifts. The Baltimore Sun reported that the Great Marble Capitol looked like a snow palace. This description captures both the beauty and the horror of the situation. Yes, the snow-covered building was magnificent, but this was also a city brought to a complete standstill, where basic services couldn't function, where people were trapped in their homes, unable to get food or fuel. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Fish died in large numbers in rivers and lakes, killed by temperatures that their cold-blooded systems couldn't survive. Game birds froze to death mid-flight, falling from the sky like feathered stones. Livestock perished across the country despite farmers' desperate efforts to save them. The human toll was also significant. The US Weather Bureau reported that between January 29th and February 13th, 105 Americans died from avalanches and the freezing temperatures. This was just the official count. The actual death toll was almost certainly higher, as many deaths in isolated areas went unreported. Some people froze to death in their homes when their heating failed and they lacked resources to restore it. Others died while travelling, caught away from shelter when the extreme cold struck. Still others perished while trying to care for animals or protect property, making the calculation that their livelihoods were worth the risk of venturing into killing cold. The geographic range of the extreme temperatures was historic. The Great Arctic Outbreak affected regions from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from the Canadian border to the Gulf Coast. This wasn't cold concentrated in one region, while others remained mild. This was cold that respected no boundaries and spared no region. After gripping the Atlantic seaboard with its chill, the outbreak lashed it with an epic blizzard. Hurricane-strength winds drove snow horizontally. Nearly a foot of snow fell in the Carolinas, states that normally saw little winter precipitation. The storm then struck Washington, D.C. and continued north. New York and New England were buried. Boston and Providence recorded over 27 inches of snow. This wasn't fluffy snow that could be easily cleared. This was heavy, wet snow driven by winds that created massive drifts. The storm paralyzed railways. Trains were stranded in snowdrifts. Passengers faced days trapped in unheated cars, with dwindling food supplies and no idea when rescue might come. Thousands of commuters found themselves unable to get home, forced to shelter wherever they could find space. Commerce came to a complete halt. In an era before extensive mechanized snow removal, before weather forecasting that could give days of warning, before the infrastructure that modern cities take for granted, a blizzard of this magnitude meant complete paralysis. 200 ships were wrecked offshore in 85-mile-per-hour winds. These weren't small pleasure craft. These were working vessels, merchant ships, and fishing boats. The men aboard them had likely survived storms before, but nothing had prepared them for this. The storm demonstrated that the rapidly modernizing country still had vulnerabilities. Overhead electric wires, which were supposed to represent progress and modernity, were brought down by the weight of ice and snow. Entire neighborhoods lost power. Businesses couldn't operate. The advantages of electricity vanished when the infrastructure couldn't withstand extreme weather. The disaster taught important lessons that would shape future urban planning. The need to bury electric wires became obvious. The advantages of subway systems over above-ground transportation were demonstrated. Infrastructure had to be built not for average conditions, but for the extremes that nature could deliver. But in the moment, these future lessons were cold comfort to people struggling to survive. The cold wave and subsequent blizzard created food shortages in cities that depended on regular supply from the countryside. When transportation systems failed, when trains and ships couldn't move, urban populations faced the terrifying possibility of famine. There were real concerns about starvation in major cities, not in some remote frontier region, but in New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Places that considered themselves the epitome of civilization and progress. The veneer of modernity was revealed as shockingly thin when nature demonstrated its power. The overall death toll from the Great Arctic Outbreak probably exceeded 400 people when accounting for all causes, direct and indirect. This includes those who froze to death directly, those who died in the blizzard, those who perished in shipwrecks, and those who succumbed to fires started while trying to stay warm, or illness contracted while weakened by cold. Even with the warmer temperatures that came in the latter half of the month, February 1899 remains one of the coldest Februaries ever recorded in the United States. But more than the raw numbers, it's the geographic range that made this event so significant. The Great Arctic Outbreak proved that nowhere in the continental United States was truly safe from extreme cold. The South, which had thought itself protected by latitude, learned that Arctic air masses could push far enough south to freeze orange groves. The coasts, which had relied on maritime influences to moderate temperature extremes, found that the ocean's protection had limits. This democratization of winter's fury, this demonstration that no region held immunity, changed how Americans thought about weather and climate. It became clear that extreme weather events could happen anywhere. That preparation for unlikely scenarios was necessary, that assuming it can't happen here was dangerously naive. The cold snap of 1899 also coincided with and contributed to other historical events. Some historians argue that the extreme cold and heavy rains in Europe during this period may have contributed to Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo 3 months after the February cold snap, though this connection is debated. What's clear is that the Great Arctic Outbreak demonstrated the interconnected nature of climate and human systems. When weather became extreme, the impacts rippled through agriculture, commerce, transportation, communication, and every other aspect of civilization. Modern conveniences and infrastructure proved less reliable than people had assumed. As we continue exploring history's coldest winters, remember that geographic location provides no guarantee of protection from extreme weather. Remember that infrastructure built for normal conditions may fail catastrophically when tested by extremes. And remember that even wealthy, developed societies can be brought to their knees when nature decides to remind humanity of its place in the natural order. The Great Arctic Outbreak entered American folklore as proof that winter could strike anywhere, any time, with devastating force. Its lessons remain relevant today as we face the increasing unpredictability of weather patterns driven by climate change. The 1930s were already desperate years across much of the world. The Great Depression had destroyed economies, eliminated jobs, and pushed millions into poverty. Banks had failed. Farms had been foreclosed. Unemployment stood at staggering levels. People who had once been middle class now stood in breadlines. Then came the winter of 1935 to 1936, adding nature's cruelty to economic disaster. The cold began early, settling over the Great Plains in November of 1935. Temperatures were well below normal across most areas west of the Mississippi River. November 1935 was one of the coldest Novembers on record for Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and North Dakota. This was an ominous beginning, a warning that the winter ahead would test people who were already struggling to survive the Depression. But the worst was still to come. December brought the cold to the eastern half of the United States. Most places recorded temperatures much below average. Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina had their second coldest Decembers on record. In Florida, where people had fled to escape northern winters, the average temperature was just 50.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The month began with a mild spell in the eastern states, offering false hope that the early cold might moderate. But by the 19th, a large blizzard-like storm covered the eastern half of the country. 2 people died in New Jersey. 2 more perished in the Catskill Mountains, and this was just the beginning. January 1936 brought conditions that many who lived through it remembered as the coldest they'd ever experienced. The Midwestern United States and Canadian prairies were hit hardest. Fort Resolution in the Northwest Territories of Canada recorded 75 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on January 8th, 18th, and 21st. This remains one of the coldest temperatures ever recorded in North America, but the extremes weren't limited to remote northern regions. McIntosh, South Dakota sank to 58 degrees below zero. Partial, North Dakota hit 60 below. These were inhabited places where people were trying to survive the winter in homes that often lacked adequate heating or insulation. At Devil's Lake, North Dakota, the average temperature for 5 weeks ending in February was 21 degrees below zero. Not the low temperature, the average, for 5 weeks. Try to imagine that. Every morning waking to temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. Every day a struggle just to maintain enough warmth to survive. Every night wondering if the fire would go out, if the fuel would last, if tomorrow would be the day your luck ran out. February was by far the coldest month of this severe winter. Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota experienced their coldest month on record. This wasn't just the coldest February. This was the coldest month period, colder than any January or December in the historical record. The cold wave was related to a highly negative North Atlantic Oscillation event, which drove cold Arctic air deep into North America. Only the southwestern United States and California largely escaped its effects. Schools across the Midwest, Great Plains, and Pacific Northwest were closed for weeks by deep snowdrifts. Children couldn't travel to school. In many cases, adults couldn't travel to work. Communities were isolated, cut off from supply and support. Remember, this was before widespread car ownership. Many families relied on walking or on animals for transportation. Deep snow and extreme cold made both impossible. Being isolated during the Depression, when many families were already struggling to feed themselves, could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Skis had to be used in rescue operations as a succession of snowstorms hit the Pacific Northwest states and much of the nation east of the Continental Divide. Emergency services struggled to reach people who needed help. Medical emergencies became potential death sentences because doctors couldn't reach patients. The combination of economic depression and extreme weather created conditions of extraordinary hardship. People who were already unemployed, already struggling to feed their families, now faced a winter that demanded resources they simply didn't have. Heating fuel was expensive. Food prices rose as transportation difficulties made supply irregular. Clothing adequate for such extreme cold was beyond what many families could afford. Homes that might have been adequate in normal times proved woefully insufficient when temperatures dropped to record lows. There are accounts from this period of families burning furniture to stay warm because they couldn't afford coal or wood, of children suffering frostbite because they lacked proper winter clothing, of elderly people freezing to death in their homes because they couldn't afford adequate heating. The livestock losses were enormous, though exact numbers are difficult to determine. Cattle, sheep, and horses died by the thousands. For farmers already struggling with Depression-era low prices and drought conditions that had afflicted parts of the country, losing animals to the cold was a catastrophe that could mean complete ruin. The meteorological winter of December through February 1935-36 was the coldest on record for Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. This winter was much colder than the immediately preceding winters, which had each seen exceptionally mild conditions in parts of the United States. The contrast was psychologically brutal. People had experienced several relatively easy winters, might have let their preparations slip, might have assumed that extreme cold was a thing of the past. Then came a winter that exceeded anything in the historical record. The cold finally broke in March, when above average to near average temperatures were recorded throughout most of the United States, except for the Pacific Northwest. But the end of the cold brought new problems. The melting of the heavy winter snowfalls and thawing of the ground, along with the wettest March on record in the northeastern states, led to record floods. The rivers that had been frozen solid now swelled beyond their banks. Smaller tributary streams overflowed, inundating communities that had just survived the winter. For people who had endured months of life-threatening cold, who had depleted their resources and energy just staying alive, facing major flooding was almost beyond endurance. Homes that had survived the winter were now threatened by rising waters. Farms that were supposed to be planting spring crops were instead underwater. The floods destroyed property, contaminated water supplies, and displaced thousands of people. The cleanup would take months. The recovery would take years, and all of this was happening in the midst of the Great Depression, when resources for relief were severely limited. Looking back at the winter of 1936, several things stand out. First, it demonstrated that economic crisis and natural disaster can compound each other in devastating ways. The same winter might have been survivable for a prosperous population with resources to invest in preparation and relief. For a population already impoverished by the Depression, it was catastrophic. Second, it showed that even in the 20th century, with all the advantages of modern technology and infrastructure, extreme weather could bring civilization to its knees. Cars were useless when roads were impassable. Electricity helped only if the power lines stayed up and you could afford to pay for power. Modern homes provided better shelter than frontier cabins, but not if you couldn't afford fuel to heat them. Third, it reinforced the lesson that climate isn't stable. The mild winters of the early 1930s had lulled people into assuming that extreme cold was unlikely. Then came a winter that shattered all previous records, proving once again that basing preparations on recent history, rather than the full range of possible conditions, is dangerous. The survivors of the winter of 1936 carried its memory for the rest of their lives. For many who lived through it, this remained the coldest winter they ever experienced, the standard against which all subsequent winters were measured. Their stories, passed down to children and grandchildren, became part of American folklore. The winter when you could walk across the frozen Mississippi, when school was closed for weeks, when cattle froze standing up, when simply surviving from one day to the next was an accomplishment worth celebrating. As we near the end of our journey through history's coldest winters, remember the families who endured the winter of 1936 while already struggling with the Depression. Remember that disasters rarely come alone, that multiple crises can compound each other in ways that exceed the sum of their parts. And remember that survival under such conditions requires not just individual strength, but community support and collective determination to care for the most vulnerable. Throughout our journey across centuries of winter's cruelty, certain patterns emerge. The people who survived history's coldest winters did so not through superhuman strength or individual heroism, but through preparation, community support, adaptation, and sometimes simple luck. Let's explore the strategies that allowed our ancestors to endure conditions that killed so many others. Preparation was always the foundation of survival. The families who weathered the Little Ice Age most successfully were those who understood that summer's abundance had to sustain them through winter's scarcity. They dried, salted, smoked, and preserved food with obsessive care. They gathered firewood month after month, building supplies that seemed excessive until winter proved them barely adequate, Root cellars dug into the earth maintained temperatures that prevented freezing while keeping vegetables fresh for months. Hay was gathered and stored with the same care as food for humans, because without healthy animals, frontier families couldn't plough fields or transport goods. Every aspect of preparation was interconnected, a complex web of provisions that had to be maintained if survival was to be possible. The families who failed often did so because they miscalculated. They assumed a normal winter and prepared accordingly. They believed they could adapt if conditions proved worse than expected. They thought their strength and determination would be sufficient. Then came a winter that exceeded their preparations, and they paid with their lives. Shelter was the next critical element. A cabin with gaps between the logs meant death when temperatures dropped far below zero. Families learned through bitter experience which materials worked best for chinking. Mud and moss and dried grass, applied with knowledge passed down through generations or learned through trial and error. Chimneys had to draw properly, directing smoke out while keeping warm air in. Windows, which provided light and view, also provided avenues for heat loss. The trade-offs had to be carefully managed. Too many windows and you froze. Too few and you lived in darkness for months. The psychological toll nearly as dangerous as the physical cold. Heating technology improved across the centuries we've explored. Open fires in the center of communal halls gave way to fireplaces in individual rooms, then to cast iron stoves that provided more efficient heat with less fuel consumption. But technology was only useful if you could afford it and if you had the fuel to burn. The families who survived winters like 1816 or 1936 often did so because they made hard choices about fuel conservation. They heated only one room, abandoning the rest of the house to the cold. They went to bed early to conserve candles and lamp oil, huddling under layers of quilts and furs. They rationed their firewood with the same care they rationed food, always calculating how long supplies would last. Clothing adapted to meet winter's demands. The widespread use of buttons and buttonholes during the Little Ice Age, the knitting of custom-made undergarments, these weren't fashion choices but survival necessities. Fur and wool were prized not for their appearance but for their life-saving properties. Multiple layers created insulating air pockets. Hats prevented heat loss through the head. Mittens worked better than gloves because fingers together retained warmth better than fingers separated. Boots had to be waterproof and insulated because wet feet in extreme cold meant frostbite, and frostbite meant amputation or death. The knowledge of how to dress for extreme cold was hard won and carefully passed down. Indigenous peoples, who had survived on the plains and in the Arctic for thousands of years before European contact, possessed sophisticated understanding of cold weather clothing. Those European settlers who learned from indigenous knowledge holders generally fared better than those who relied solely on their own experience. Food was both fuel and morale. Calories became heat in the body. A well-fed person could maintain body temperature in conditions that would kill someone who was starving. This meant that food shortages during extreme winters had a multiplier effect, making people more vulnerable to the cold while also depriving them of nutrition. The families who survived often did so through careful rationing. They calculated how many people they had to feed, how long winter might last, and divided their supplies accordingly. They ate less during the worst months, preserving strength while ensuring supplies would last. Some foods were more valuable in winter than others. Fats and proteins provided concentrated calories. Salt pork, though monotonous, kept people alive when nothing else was available. Root vegetables provided nutrition that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The variety we take for granted was impossible, but basic nutrition was essential. Water access could mean the difference between life and death. When rivers and wells froze, obtaining drinking water became a major challenge. Melting snow required fuel, depleting precious firewood supplies. Chopping through ice to reach flowing water was dangerous, exhausting work. The families who survived had planned for water access. They knew where springs might still flow even when surface water froze. They knew techniques for melting snow efficiently. They understood that dehydration could kill even in cold environments, that the body needed water to function. Community support networks provided safety nets that saved countless lives. When one family ran short of food, neighbors shared. When someone fell ill, others provided care. When a storm trapped someone away from home, others provided shelter. This wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was mutual aid based on the understanding that survival depended on cooperation. Today you help your neighbor. Tomorrow they help you. Those who hoarded their resources and refused to share often found themselves isolated when they needed help. And isolation in extreme winter could mean death. Churches, civic organizations, and informal community groups organized relief efforts. They identified the most vulnerable, the elderly living alone, the families with young children, the sick who couldn't care for themselves. They coordinated resource sharing. They checked on people during the worst weather. The families who survived extreme winters often did so not because they had more resources than their neighbors, but because they were embedded in networks of mutual support that helped everyone survive. Adaptation was essential when conditions exceeded all preparation. When supplies ran low, people ate things they would have rejected in better times. Bark, roots, leather boiled for whatever nutrition it might provide. The dignity of normal meals gave way to the desperate mathematics of survival. When fuel ran out, people burned furniture, parts of their buildings, anything that would produce heat. When clothing wore out, it was patched and repatched until it was more repair than original fabric. When animals died, every part was used, nothing wasted. The psychological adaptations were perhaps even more important than the physical ones. People learned to find joy in small pleasures. A moment of sunshine through the window, a child's laughter despite hardship, a successful meal prepared from scanty ingredients, the maintenance of hope when circumstances seemed hopeless. Families developed routines that provided structure to days that might otherwise blend into an endless blur of cold and confinement. Children were educated even when schools couldn't operate. Adults pursued hobbies and crafts that kept minds engaged. Stories were told around fires, preserving culture and providing entertainment that required no resources beyond memory and voice. The ability to maintain mental health during months of isolation and hardship was crucial. Depression could lead to giving up, to making careless mistakes, to lacking the will to do what survival demanded. Communities that maintained morale through shared activities, through music and storytelling, through religious observance or other communal practices, generally fared better than those where people retreated into isolated despair. Knowledge transmission was essential for long-term survival. The families who endured multiple severe winters were those who learned from each experience and passed those lessons to the next generation. They taught children to read weather signs, to prepare adequately, to respect nature's power. Elders who had survived previous severe winters held valuable knowledge. They remembered what had worked and what had failed. They could distinguish between normal winter hardship and the onset of something more dangerous. Societies that respected and listened to elder knowledge generally survived better than those that dismissed it as outdated or irrelevant. But knowledge had to be combined with flexibility. Conditions changed. What worked in one winter might not work in the next. The families who survived were those who could adapt their strategies to changing circumstances while maintaining the core principles of preparation, community support, and respect for nature's power. Luck finally played a role that must be acknowledged. Some families prepared perfectly and still lost children to disease. Some communities supported each other fully and still saw members freeze to death in unexpected storms. Some individuals did everything right and still suffered catastrophic losses. The randomness of survival, the role of chance in determining who lived and who died, is humbling. It reminds us that we are not fully in control of our fates. We can prepare, we can adapt, we can support each other, but we cannot guarantee survival. This doesn't mean preparation is futile. On the contrary, preparation dramatically improved odds of survival. But it does mean we should approach discussions of historical survival with humility, recognizing that those who died weren't necessarily less worthy or less prepared than those who lived. As we conclude our exploration of survival strategies, several key lessons emerge. Preparation matters intensely, but must be based on realistic assessment of what extreme conditions might demand. Community support provides resilience that individuals alone cannot achieve. Adaptation to changing conditions is essential when circumstances exceed all planning. And humility in the face of nature's power is not weakness but wisdom. These lessons, learned through centuries of bitter experience, remain relevant today. We face different challenges than our ancestors, but the fundamental realities of human vulnerability and interdependence haven't changed. We survive not through individual strength, but through collective care. Not through dominating nature, but through respecting its power and working within its constraints. As our journey through these frozen chapters of human history comes to a close, let's reflect on what these experiences can teach us about resilience, community, and our place in the natural world. The first and perhaps most important lesson is that climate change doesn't have to be dramatic to be devastating. The Little Ice Age cooled European temperatures by only about 2 degrees Celsius. This seemingly modest shift was enough to collapse Norse colonies, destroy agricultural systems that had sustained communities for centuries, cause famines that killed millions, and fundamentally transform European society. We often think of climate change in catastrophic terms, ice ages that bury continents, or runaway warming that makes the planet uninhabitable. But history shows that even small shifts, sustained over time, can exceed human capacity to adapt. A growing season shortened by just a few weeks, a winter that extends just a bit longer than normal. These changes, repeated year after year, can be as deadly as sudden catastrophic events. The second lesson is that preparation has limits. The Grande Armée that marched into Russia was one of the most professional, well-equipped military forces ever assembled. Napoleon was arguably the greatest military commander of his age. His soldiers were veterans with extensive campaign experience. None of this prevented the catastrophic losses that winter inflicted. Preparation improves odds of survival, sometimes dramatically. But it doesn't guarantee survival. There are conditions that exceed any reasonable preparation. There are combinations of circumstances that no amount of planning can fully address. Humility in the face of this reality isn't defeatism, it's wisdom. The third lesson is that community support is essential for survival during extreme hardship. Again and again, the accounts of winter survival emphasize mutual aid, resource sharing, collective action to protect the vulnerable. Those who tried to face extreme winters alone, trusting only their own resources and strength, frequently didn't survive. This isn't just historical curiosity. It's a fundamental truth about human nature and social organization. We are not solitary species. We evolved as social animals who survive through cooperation. The rugged individualism that American culture sometimes celebrates is actually a recipe for failure when conditions become extreme. The fourth lesson is that infrastructure built for normal conditions may fail catastrophically during extremes. The overhead power lines that came down during the Great Arctic Outbreak, the transportation systems that paralyzed during the winter of 1936, the massive ranching operations that collapsed during the Great Die-Up. All of these systems worked well under normal conditions. They failed when tested by extremes. This suggests we should design infrastructure not for average conditions but for the worst plausible scenarios. This costs more up front. It seems wasteful during the many years when such extreme preparedness isn't needed. But when the extreme event arrives, adequate infrastructure means the difference between manageable disruption and catastrophic failure. The fifth lesson is that traditional knowledge, developed over generations of lived experience in particular environments, contains wisdom that modern science sometimes struggles to capture. The indigenous knowledge holders who read weather signs in animal behavior, who understood what extreme winter demanded, who had developed survival strategies through centuries of adaptation, possessed insights that European settlers often dismissed as primitive superstition. Those settlers who learned from indigenous knowledge generally fared better than those who relied solely on their own experience or on scientific understanding developed in different environments. This doesn't mean traditional knowledge is always superior to modern science, but it does suggest that the two should be combined rather than treated as competitors. The sixth lesson is that economic crisis and natural disaster compound each other in devastating ways. The winter of 1936 would have been challenging in any circumstances. Coming during the Great Depression, when families had already exhausted their resources, when unemployment was massive, when social safety nets were minimal, it became catastrophic. This has implications for how we think about resilience. A society that maintains economic stability and reduces poverty isn't just creating comfortable lives for its members, it's building resilience against natural disasters that might arrive at any moment. The resources that seem excessive during good times become essential during crises. The seventh lesson is that climate isn't stable. The mild winters of the early 1930s, the medieval warm period that preceded the Little Ice Age, the relatively moderate conditions between major winter disasters, all of these created false confidence that extreme conditions were unlikely or belonged to the past. Then came winters that exceeded anything in living memory, that shattered previous records, that proved the danger of basing expectations on recent experience rather than the full range of historical variability. This suggests we should plan for extremes even when recent experience suggests they're unlikely. The eighth lesson is that survival often comes down to factors beyond individual control. The family that prepared perfectly but lost a child to disease during the winter of 1816. The soldier in the Grande Armée who did everything right but froze to death anyway. The homesteader who built adequate shelter and stored sufficient food but was killed by a random blizzard while checking on animals. Acknowledging the role of chance isn't fatalism. It's recognition that we can improve our odds without guaranteeing particular outcomes. This should promote compassion toward those who suffer disasters, recognition that "it could have been me" isn't just theoretical humility but factual reality. The ninth lesson is that human resilience is both greater and more limited than we often assume. Greater in that people survived conditions we might think impossible. The families who endured the Little Ice Age's centuries of cold. The survivors of Napoleon's retreat who made it back despite everything winter threw at them. The communities that rebuilt after the Great Die-Up or the Great Arctic Outbreak, but also more limited, in that countless people didn't survive conditions that seem less extreme in retrospect. The millions who starved during Little Ice Age famines, the hundreds of thousands who froze in Napoleon's retreat, the families who simply couldn't endure one more disaster piled atop previous hardships. This suggests we should celebrate human resilience without romanticizing suffering. Yes, people can endure extraordinary hardship, but they shouldn't have to. Building societies that protect people from preventable suffering isn't coddling, it's civilization. The 10th and final lesson is that these historical experiences remain relevant today. We face climate change that's different in mechanism, but potentially comparable in impact to the Little Ice Age. We have infrastructure that might fail under extreme conditions we haven't fully prepared for. We have economic systems that create vulnerability for large populations. We have the same human tendency to base expectations on recent experience rather than full historical ranges of variability. The specific challenges change. The fundamental realities of human vulnerability and interdependence remain constant. The lessons our ancestors learned through bitter experience, through trial and error that cost countless lives, are lessons we can learn from their experience rather than having to repeat their suffering. As you drift towards sleep tonight, wherever you are, whatever warmth surrounds you, take a moment to appreciate it. The shelter that keeps you safe from the elements, the food that fills your stomach, the community that would support you if disaster struck, the technology that makes survival easier than our ancestors could have imagined. But also remember that these comforts aren't guaranteed, that nature's power to disrupt human civilization hasn't diminished, that extreme winters, though rarer than they once were in some regions, remain possible, that preparation, community support and humility before nature's power remain as essential as ever. The families who survived history's coldest winters did so through preparation, adaptation, community support, and sometimes simple luck. They survived so that we could be here today. Their stories, preserved through written accounts and oral traditions, are gifts they left us, lessons bought with immeasurable suffering. We honor their memory not through romanticizing their hardship, but through learning from their experience, through building resilient communities, through maintaining infrastructure that can withstand extremes, through respecting nature's power while working to protect the most vulnerable from its worst impacts. Sleep well tonight, knowing that somewhere in the past families very much like yours found the strength to endure winters that seemed designed to erase all human presence from the earth. They survived, they adapted, they persevered, and because of their resilience, life continued, leading eventually to this moment where you can rest in safety and warmth. The cycle continues as it always has and always will. Winter comes, testing those who face it. Some survive, some don't. The survivors carry forward the lessons learned, passing them to the next generation who will face their own trials. May we learn from the past without having to repeat all of its suffering. May we prepare for challenges while hoping they never arrive. May we build communities that support all members through whatever trials nature sends our way. And may we always remember that we are part of nature, not separate from it or above it. We live at nature's sufferance, not by our own dominion. Humility before this reality isn't weakness. It's the wisdom our ancestors gained through centuries of bitter experience. Good night, wherever you are in the world. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams warm. May you never know the cold that our ancestors endured. And may you always remember that survival, ultimately, is a gift we share with one another through collective care and mutual support across generations. The story of humanity's coldest winters is not primarily a story of individual heroism or conquest over nature. It's a story of communities coming together, of knowledge passed down through generations, of preparation and adaptation, and stubborn refusal to surrender. It's a story that continues today, in different forms but with the same essential themes, as winter continues its eternal cycle, as climate systems shift and change, as new challenges emerge that our ancestors never faced. May we carry forward the lessons they learned. May we prepare with wisdom. May we support one another with generosity. May we face the future with both realism about the challenges ahead and hope that human resilience, combined with collective care, will prove sufficient for whatever trials await. The coldest winters in human history tested our species nearly to the breaking point. We survived. The question now is not whether we can survive future challenges, but whether we will learn from past experiences to reduce suffering and protect the most vulnerable as we face whatever climate and fortune send our way. Rest now, in whatever warmth and shelter you enjoy. Tomorrow brings its own challenges. Tonight, let the stories of those who survived history's coldest winters remind you that humans have faced seemingly impossible conditions before and endured. We carry their resilience in our blood. We inherit their hard-won wisdom. We share their fundamental vulnerability and their potential for community support that makes survival possible. Sleep well. The winter of the past is over. The winters of the future remain to be faced. But tonight, in this moment, you are warm and safe.